It was great to see the Fangboar get a promotion to a full-on war pig. Some people said that this armor is reminiscent of Havel armor, but I would compare it much more to the stone armor in Dark Souls 1 personally. Invisible flooring has been a thing here and there throughout the series, but Dark Souls was the first instance of it. While a mechanic like the skull lantern is somewhat redundant, now that there's torches and lanterns, it was still fun bringing it back with the lamenting visage, given the additional skill it has. The aesthetic with all the giant coffins sticking out of the walls and such in the stone coffin fissure reminds me a lot of the Tomb of the Giants with a similar format. Perhaps it could also be paralleled with the untended graves, especially with the giant coffin in the Gundyr arena. The fiery lava forge aesthetic of the ruined forges, especially with the giant stone pipes, feels very reminiscent of the Iron Keep and some other areas in Dark Souls 2. The lamprey and the finger ruins feel very similar to the coal tar enemies in Dark Souls 2, Black Gulch. There's also some similarities to the Pisakas, and now that I've seen the paralysis attack, the brain suckers could also be a possible inspiration, especially with the more fishy inspiration. I didn't really feel like farming it, but the Gurmgrade hammer that they drop, being an anvil weapon, is, well, done once again in the anvil hammer. The lady mixed within the Ragnid is certainly nothing new at this rate. The original iteration was Quelaag with a spider, but the closest one is Scorpionish Nashka from Dark Souls 2. Given there's also a centipede in the mix with Ramina, perhaps there's some potential influence from Sekiro as well. The design of Jori and the Inquisitor enemies reminds me a fair bit of the Prowling Magus. I imagine it's primarily the horse skull with the horns, but given they're also primarily spellcasters with the giant staff, there could be something there. The Specimen Storehouse has a similar vibe to Aldia's Keep, at least in theory. The research hall is also something to point to, given the rising platform mechanic and the ceiling scaffolding. While having a more intense animation, Blind Spot in Elden Ring has the same function as Dark Souls 3, going around the guard of an opponent to do direct damage. They're even named the same. The dancing motif of the Blades of Rana has the same vibe and similar animations both to the Graveworn enemies and the Dancer's swords. The aggressive, dual-wielding swordsman with differently elemented swords, both having one covered in flames and one in moonlit magic. It certainly feels like an intentional inspiration, even if that's where the similarities end. There's some undeniable parallels between the brothers Miquella and Radahn, and Lothric and Lorien, both being a piggyback ride, while supporting the bigger, more melee-based brothers, with holy spells. This is likely a complete coincidence, but the twincest joke the fanbase made for Lothric and Lorien kinda became a reality with Miquella and Radahn. The dropdown and arena of Pitchusent Night is undoubtedly inspired by the cave where you find Midir. The guillotine weapon the knight uses also reminds me a lot of the Orphan of Cos's placenta hook weapon in its shape. Speaking of Midir though, while they're quite differently designed visually, both of these are dragons that are almost more so crawling along the ground to have a lower hitbox, as opposed to the other dragons in the series, such as Calamite. The flurry of dark slashes of the Sword of Night almost undoubtedly feels like an expansion on the ones the Frayed Blade has, just as the laser beam was an expansion in the Moonveil. These statue corpses around Bellerat are nearly identical to the monumental corpses you see at the top of the Nexus in Demon Souls. I wouldn't even be surprised if it was a reused asset in some way. The jet black knight armor was very reminiscent to me of the gloom armor worn by Yurt. The main thing that sells it for me is the vertical spikes on the shoulders. That's a very rare touch in their armor sets, so it feels incredibly intentional. The clone mechanic of the Lamenter boss fight is undoubtedly inspired by the Fool's Idol boss fight, which was reused in later boss fights as well, such as Crystal Sage. The main difference is that simply hitting the Lamenter clones once isn't quite enough to take them out, plus the fact that you're punished for not killing them if you don't manage to kill the main boss fast enough. The yellow torn robe that Midra wears feels like it calls back to the robe Old Monk wears, which becomes the head wrappings for the corresponding boss fight. The Old Monk isn't described as particularly sane either, so perhaps there's some underlying thematic influences there too. The song for the boss fight is also very reminiscent of the Bloodborne soundtrack, which is incredibly appropriate. The orbs you cast around your character with the Horned Bairn is identical to how Homing Soul Arrow works in Demon Souls and later games, though the speed at which they track the opponent is closer to the Pursuers in Dark Souls 1. The Furnace Golem might be loosely calling back to the Dirty Colossus' general structure, simply a number of times bigger and fire-based instead. Undoubtedly they're both inspired by Wickerman. A catalyst that can cast all types of spells in their corresponding games have come in and out throughout the series, but the first iteration was as early as Demon Souls, with the Talisman of Beasts. And speaking of which, I mentioned this prior with the Elden Beast, but even more so than that one, there does seem to be some strong parallels between Metyr and the Old One, both essentially being the god figures of the world, or at the very least channel them, and is certainly reinforced by the fact that their catalysts cast all the spell types. The feathers alone are a close enough comparison for these two sets, but the way there's a part in the middle to emulate wings is a very inspired choice that feels like a very intentional callback to me, certainly even more likely than the raptor's black feathers prior. One of the most iconic and undeniable throwbacks in the DLC, the aging Untouchables function nearly identically to the Winter Lanterns from Bloodborne, which are even referenced by name in one of those flies you can pick up for crafting material. Though mechanically they expanded on the Winter Lanterns enough to still be a fresh and different encounter entirely. Aesthetically, it also borrows elements from the Amygdala and Garden of Eyes, particularly the head, having the encased head starting out, then popping out eyes like the former, and the more bug-looking eyes like the latter. The tassels/rope things that adorn both the Horn Scent and Yahar Ghul armor feel like a potential reference. The Iron Mask Alsbach has in his set, especially with the grey hair sticking out from behind, calls back to the Cainhurst Iron Mask, or even more specifically to Queen Annalise herself. The fact that Ansbach and the Valbloods both have associations with, well, blood, also adds to this reading. Dancing Lion somewhat reminds me of Ludwig, in that they're both obviously humanoid entities that have many more limbs than they should, but are also an amalgamation of animal parts. The face both being eerily human while having the shape of an animal also feels very poignant. The Erdtree fragment system is really close to a blend of the prayer beads and memory system in Sekiro, though instead of always being dropped by bosses, it's usually more so found by exploring. One of the more fun mechanics that were brought back, the deflecting heart tier is literally just a Sekiro deflect system, but adjusted in a way that works for Elden. The way both of these are in the far right corner of the room before coming at you reminded me of each other. These two games also seem to be the most willing to use regular animals as enemies and bosses, so I think it's worthwhile mentioning, despite the fact that they are different animals. The general hand-to-hand arts feel reminiscent to some of the temple art skills in Sekiro, such as the praying strikes and the Senpu leaping kick. It could also be calling back to the fist weapon moveset in Dark Souls 2. The incredibly dexterous primate enemies do feel like an intentional callback to me. As mentioned earlier, relatively normal animals are somewhat new to FromSoft games, so having back-to-back games with monkeys using swords while being incredibly agile is noteworthy, even if they're not named so. And that's all for the video. If you disagree with any of these, feel free to respectfully let me know if you do, or if you thought of any that you think I missed, do feel free to let me know below as well. I will give a heart to any that I think are pretty legit. And I'm also considering eventually putting all the videos together that I've done of these in the past, so to make a super Elden Ring callbacks video for all the games. So it would certainly be featured there as well. Speaking of which, if you haven't seen those, here are the videos for you to choose from. If you enjoyed this, you certainly will enjoy those as well. If you do like my content, do consider subscribing as well. And thank you to my members for supporting my channel. But yeah, I hope to see you again, everybody. Have a good one. Bye bye.